The locksmith's van was still parked in my driveway when I turned onto Aldermore Street. White van, magnetic logo on the door, engine running. I slowed without thinking, the way you slow when something familiar has been rearranged without your permission. I'd been on a job site since 6 that morning. A commercial renovation in Terre Haute, 2 hours each way, and my back ached, and I had sawdust in my collar, and all I'd wanted for the last 40 miles was a shower and something hot to eat. I pulled up to the curb instead of the driveway and sat there with the truck idling and watched a man in a gray uniform load a drill case into the back of the van and shut the doors. He drove away without looking at me. I sat there another minute. The porch light was on. The front door was the same color it had always been, the dark green I'd painted it myself 3 summers ago. 2 coats, a Saturday afternoon with the boys playing in the yard. Same door, different lock. I could see it from the street. The brass was too bright, too new, the kind of new that only happens when something has just been replaced. I got out of the truck and walked up the front path and tried my key. It didn't turn. My name is Marcus. I was 44 years old that September, the owner of a small contracting firm I'd built from a single crew and a used pickup truck over 15 years. We specialized in residential renovation, kitchens, additions, structural work, and I had a reputation in Crestwood Falls that I'd earned slowly and protected carefully. I had calloused hands and a bad left shoulder from a fall in my late 20s and a habit of arriving early everywhere that my boys had inherited and my wife had always found excessive. Renee and I had been married 14 years. The house was mine before it was ours, a 1940s Craftsman on Aldermore Street that I'd bought at 27, gutted to the studs, and rebuilt over 4 years in the evenings and on weekends before we met. Every room had my fingerprints in it, literally. The kitchen cabinets, I'd made them. The hardwood in the hallway, I'd laid it. The bathroom tile, the crown molding, the rebuilt fireplace surround, all of it done by hand, by me, before Renee ever walked through the door. She walked through the door on a Tuesday in October, 14 years ago, brought by a mutual friend who thought we'd get along. We got along. She was sharp and funny and moved through the world with a particular confidence I found immediately compelling. She was already working in real estate, already building something of her own, and I respected that. We were similar in the ways that mattered then: self-made, practical, forward-moving. We had twin boys 2 years into the marriage, Joel and Caleb, now 11, who had their mother's precision and my stubbornness in varying combinations, and whom I loved with an uncomplicated ferocity that was the clearest thing in my life. I stood on the front porch of my own house, in the dark, with a useless key in my hand. My phone buzzed. A text from Renee. The papers were filed today. I think it's better if you stay somewhere else for now. I'll have your things ready by the weekend. I read it twice. Then I took a photograph of the new lock. I don't know exactly why I did that. Instinct, maybe, or something quieter than instinct. Some part of me that had been paying attention for longer than I'd consciously admitted. The photograph was crisp in the porch light. Brass hardware, fresh scratches around the cylinder where the installation had been rushed. I sent it to no one. I just kept it. And then I drove to a motel on Route 9 and sat on the edge of a bed that smelled of industrial detergent and thought about everything I knew and everything I hadn't yet done with knowing it. Because the truth was, I had known about Owen for 11 weeks. 14 years of marriage looks like a lot of things depending on which part you're standing in. From the outside, ours looked solid. A house that had been featured in a local home renovation piece 3 years ago. 2 well-adjusted boys who played travel soccer and got decent grades and fought with each other the way brothers do, constantly and without real malice. A business that had survived the 2020 slowdown and come out steadier on the other side. A wife with her own career, her own clients, her own professional reputation in a town where reputation is the actual currency. From the inside, the last 2 years had been something different. Not dramatic. Nothing you could point to and say there. That's where it started. More like the gradual dimming of a room you're sitting in. So slow you don't reach for the lamp until the dark is already complete. Renee worked long hours. She always had. Real estate in a mid-sized Midwest town runs on relationships and availability, and she had cultivated both with genuine skill. Evening showings, weekend open houses, client dinners that ran late. These were the architecture of her professional life, and I had built my schedule around them the way you build around a load-bearing wall. You don't resent it, you just factor it in. But something shifted in the texture of the late evenings. Small things. The particular quality of distraction when she came home, present in the room but absent from it, answering Caleb's question about homework with half her attention while her thumb moved across her phone screen in the way it did when she was composing something, not reading. I noticed it and filed it under busy season. October through December was always her heaviest stretch. I was wrong to file it there. I understand that now. The name Owen had been in our lives for years, a colleague at her agency, one of 3 other agents who shared the Aldermore Realty office on 4th Street. I'd met him at the agency's summer party 2 years running. Medium height, well-dressed, the kind of man who holds good eye contact and asks follow-up questions that make you feel heard. I hadn't liked or disliked him. He was simply part of the professional landscape my wife inhabited, a background figure in the scenery of her work. The first time the scenery shifted was a Friday in late June. I'd finished a site walkthrough early and decided to stop by Renee's office with coffee. Not a habit, just an impulse, the kind of thing that seemed like a reasonable thing a husband might do on a warm Friday afternoon. The office was a glass-fronted space on a busy block, and I could see through the windows before I reached the door. Renee was at her desk. Owen was leaning against the edge of it, not sitting, just leaning, and they were talking with the ease of people who have recently shared something that made them comfortable with each other's proximity. It was nothing visible. No contact, no looks exchanged that I could classify. Just a posture, his toward her, the particular angle of it, that registered in me the way a sound registers before you've identified what made it. I didn't go in. I stood outside for probably 30 seconds, then turned and went back to my truck and drove to the job site, and told myself I was the kind of man who didn't manufacture problems from body language. I didn't ask her about it. I didn't mention I'd stopped by. I put the coffee in the cup holder and let it go cold. Looking back, that Friday was the first point of no return, not theirs, mine. Because the moment I turned away from that window, I chose a path. I would not ask, which meant I would not know, which meant I would not have to decide what to do with knowing. It felt like patience. It was closer to abdication. July was ordinary. The boys went to soccer camp for 2 weeks. I had a big kitchen renovation in the north end of town that consumed most of my waking hours. Renee and I had dinner together 3 or 4 nights a week, which was our usual frequency, and she was pleasant and present in the surface way she'd been for months. We talked about the boys, the renovation, a family trip to Nashville we were loosely planning for fall. We didn't talk about anything that mattered. I had stopped initiating those conversations sometime in the spring, and she had stopped noticing that I'd stopped, which is its own kind of information. When 2 people in a marriage cease to reach toward each other and neither one acknowledges the gap is an absence. It's a choice that both of them are making every day, in silence, without naming it. I hadn't named it. I was afraid of what the name would cost. Then came August, and a phone I wasn't supposed to see. The phone was her old one. Renee had upgraded in July. Newer model, same carrier, transferred everything over the way you do, and the old device had been sitting in the kitchen junk drawer since then, powered down, waiting for her to decide what to do with it. I'd seen it there a dozen times while looking for batteries, or the scissors, or whatever the junk drawer absorbs. On a Wednesday in mid-August, I was looking for a tape measure and pulled the drawer too hard, and the whole thing came out. Content scattering across the counter. The old phone slid off the edge and hit the floor. I picked it up and the impact had powered it on, and before the screen went dark again, I saw the preview of a notification. A text from a number not labeled as a contact that showed the first line of a message. I read 4 words before the screen locked. 4 words. I won't write them here because they don't need the weight of being repeated. What they were was intimate, specific in the way that only people who are sharing something are specific, and in 4 words they told me everything I'd been refusing to construct from the evidence I already had. I put the phone back in the drawer. I found the tape measure. I went back to the garage and measured what I needed to measure and did not throw anything, and did not call anyone, and did not do a single dramatic thing that you might expect from a man who has just had his marriage confirmed as hollow. Instead, something very quiet happened inside me. Something that had been running hot for months. The low-grade anxiety of not knowing. The effort of maintaining studied normalcy cooled down completely. Not numbness. The opposite of numbness. A terrible, clarifying calm. I understood then that I had 2 options. The first was confrontation, the immediate, human, obvious response. Walk back inside, pull the drawer open, put the phone on the table, and say, "I saw this." The second was to do nothing visible while doing quite a lot invisible. To take the time that Renee had apparently been taking for God knows how long, to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I moved. I chose the second, not out of cowardice. I want to be clear about that distinction. I chose it because I was a man who built things for a living, and I understood that you do not tear out a load-bearing wall without first knowing what it's holding up. I needed to understand the full structure of what had been built in my marriage without my knowledge before I decided what to dismantle and what to save. The boys were in the backyard. I could hear Caleb arguing a call in their improvised game. The kitchen smelled of the chicken Renee had left marinating before she went to a showing. Everything was perfectly ordinary on its surface. I stood in the garage and thought, how long? September answered the question in the worst possible way. I had made a habit, quietly, without announcing it, of arriving home at unexpected times. Not surveillance exactly. More like paying attention to a house I'd stopped paying attention to. What I found wasn't dramatic. Inconsistencies in her schedule that were too regular to be accidental. Showings that ended earlier than her arrival time suggested. A lunch with a client in Bloomington that I cross-referenced casually against her odometer and found added up correctly only if the lunch had been somewhere significantly closer. And then there was the way she spoke about Owen in ordinary conversation. Not often. That would have been too obvious. But when his name came up, in passing, there was a particular evenness in her voice, the quality of someone who has rehearsed neutrality. You mention a colleague you feel nothing about, and your voice carries no special weight. You mention someone you're trying not to mention, and you can hear the effort of not mentioning them. I heard it every time. I didn't react. I kept my voice at the same temperature hers was performing and moved the conversation along and filed every data point in a place she couldn't see. What I didn't anticipate was my brother. My younger brother Darnell called me on a Thursday evening in late September, and there was something in his voice before he'd said anything substantive, a hesitation, a quality of someone who has been holding something and decided the holding has gone on long enough. "There's something you need to know," he said. He'd seen Renee's car parked outside Owen's house, a house on Sycamore Street that Darnell knew because he'd done a delivery there 2 years prior. He'd seen it twice, on separate weeks. He'd sat on this information for 3 weeks, he told me, because he didn't know how to give it to me, and I appreciated the honesty of that admission more than I can say. I told him I already knew. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. He went quiet. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm working on it," I said. That was the truest thing I said in any conversation that fall. What I understood, in the 10 days after Darnell's call, was that this was no longer simply about betrayal. It was about the house. Renee was a real estate agent. She understood property law in Crestwood Falls the way I understood load-bearing structures, instinctively, professionally, with an eye toward what could be moved and what couldn't. And I had begun to notice, in the weeks prior, small things. A conversation she'd ended when I walked into the kitchen that had involved the words assessed value. A manila folder in her home office that she'd covered with her laptop when I came in to ask about dinner. A call to what turned out to be a family law attorney whose number I recognized from a billboard on Route 9. She was preparing. The realization didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as the completion of a pattern I'd been half-reading for weeks. She wasn't just having an affair. She was planning an exit. And because she knew property, because she had watched me build this house and knew what it meant to me, she was planning the exit in a way that would take the house with her. Indiana is an equitable distribution state. I knew this. Every contractor in the state who'd been through a divorce or knew someone who had knew this. The house I'd bought before the marriage was mine, in principle. But 14 years of joint mortgage payments, joint tax filings, joint improvements, some of which Renee had co-signed for, had blurred that line in ways that a skilled attorney could exploit. I needed my own attorney. I needed documentation. And I needed to move before she did. I called a lawyer named Patricia Voss, who had been recommended to me 3 years ago by a client going through his own difficult divorce, and I told her the situation. She was direct and methodical and looked at the documents I brought her, original deed, mortgage history, financial records, with the focused attention of someone who spots exactly what they're looking for. "The house is defensible," she told me, "but not simple. She's going to argue contribution. She contributed to the mortgage," I said, "not to the house." "That's an important distinction," Patricia said. "We're going to need to make it clearly." For 3 weeks, I built a case the way I built a renovation, methodically, without rushing, with attention to what the structure could actually hold. I gathered the original purchase agreement, the pre-marriage renovation permits, all filed under my name alone, the material receipts, the documented hours. I had kept records, not for this purpose, but because I was the kind of man who kept records. That habit, it turned out, was worth more than I'd known. Meanwhile, I lived in my house and behaved like a man who suspected nothing. This was harder than the legal work. Dinner at the table with the boys, homework questions, weekend soccer games. All of it continuing with the surface normalcy of a family that was still intact, while underneath I was building something Renee had no idea was being built. I watched her move through our shared rooms with the particular fluency of someone who believed she was in control of the timeline. She was relaxed. She thought she had more time. She didn't know that Darnell had also told me something else, a detail he'd mentioned almost as an afterthought, something he'd seen when he drove past Owen's house the second time. Renee's car, and behind it, a real estate agency sign. Owen's agency, the same agency as Renee. I had a friend pull the recent commercial listings for the Crestwood Falls area. It took him an hour to find what I was looking for, a co-listed property, a renovated house on the east side of town, with Owen's name and Renee's name side by side on the listing sheet. They were building something together, professionally and personally, which meant her timeline wasn't just about leaving me. It was about leaving towards something specific, something already partially constructed, a future she'd been architecting while I was on job sites and at the dinner table and coaching travel soccer on alternate Saturdays. Something tightened in me that didn't loosen for a long time after. She filed on a Friday. I found out the following Monday through Patricia, who had been waiting for it. By Tuesday morning, we had our response prepared. By Tuesday evening, Renee had changed the locks. The confrontation happened in Patricia's office, not in our house. That was my choice, and it was deliberate. I had spent 11 weeks keeping this contained, keeping the geometry of it professional and documented, and I was not going to let it become a kitchen table argument that she could frame afterward any way she chose. Patricia had advised the same. The first formal meeting with Renee and her attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch who specialized in high-asset divorce in Crestwood Falls and had a reputation for aggressive discovery, was scheduled for a Wednesday morning 2 weeks after the lock change. I sat across the table from Renee for the first time since I'd left the house, and the thing I noticed most was how little she looked like someone who had done what she'd done. She was composed, well-dressed. She looked, if anything, like a woman who had made a difficult but necessary decision and was prepared to defend it. Gerald Fitch had a yellow legal pad and an air of deliberate patience. Her opening position was what I'd expected: 14 years of joint contribution to a marital home, equitable distribution, the boy's stability requiring that the family home remain intact with the primary residential parent. She was proposing that she stay in the house and I receive a buyout based on a valuation she'd commissioned from her own appraiser. A number that was, Patricia pointed out quietly, $32,000 below the market assessment. I looked at Renee across the table while Gerald was speaking. She held my eyes for a moment and then looked at her hands. Something moved across her face, not guilt exactly, more like the faint discomfort of someone who knows they are doing a thing they would prefer not to examine closely. I thought about the 4th of July 3 years ago. The boys had set off small fireworks in the backyard, and Joel had gotten too close to one, and we both grabbed him at the same moment. Her left hand, my right. And he'd been fine, laughing, and we'd looked at each other over his head with the specific relief of parents who narrowly avoided catastrophe. I had loved her in that moment with complete simplicity. That was still true, somewhere in me, and it changed nothing about what I was prepared to do. Patricia laid the first document on the table. The original deed to 14 Aldermore Street, purchased by Marcus D. Calloway in March 2006, 14 months before the marriage. Then the pre-marriage renovation permits, 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, all filed under my name, all predating the marriage, all representing 4 years of structural work that had transformed a derelict property into what it currently was. Then the material receipts. Then the comparative valuation. What the house had been worth when we married versus what it was worth now, and what portion of that increase was attributable to the pre-marriage renovation versus the years of joint occupancy. Gerald Fitch's legal pad went still. Renee looked at the documents the way you look at something you know you should have anticipated and didn't. The premarital asset classification is going to be central to our argument, Patricia said, pleasantly. Marcus built this home before the marriage, documented comprehensively, and the increased value during the marriage reflects general market appreciation in the Crestwood Falls area rather than contributions specific to either party. Gerald began to say something about the mortgage payments. Patricia had a document for that too, a breakdown showing that my income had covered 71% of all joint mortgage payments across the 14 years, Renee's income having been lower in the early years and redirected toward personal business expenses, documented through the joint tax filings that she had co-signed every April without, apparently, reading carefully. Renee said, for the first time, Marcus. Her voice had a quality in it that I recognized. The specific register she used when she wanted to shift the conversation from formal to personal, when she wanted to trade the terrain of documentation for the terrain of history and feeling, where she had always been more fluent. I looked at her steadily. Yes, this doesn't have to be this way. You changed the locks, I said. Silence. On the same day you filed, I said. On a house I built. She looked down. Gerald Fitch cleared his throat and said something about taking a brief recess. I didn't move. Patricia didn't move either. The thing I had carried quietly for 11 weeks was in the room now, fully assembled, and it was larger than any of us had named it yet. Not just the affair, the planning, the appraiser she'd hired at a below-market figure, the co-listing with Owen, which Patricia had introduced as a document at the start of the meeting and which Gerald Fitch had not looked pleased to see. The professional and personal intertwining that showed a degree of forethought and coordination that made the word affair feel insufficient for what it actually was. Renee had not just been unfaithful. She had been conducting a parallel life with full architectural intention, and the house had been a piece of that plan, something to take with her, something solid, something that had my hands in every wall, and that she had nevertheless decided belonged in her future rather than mine. I had built something real. She had tried to make it a transaction. After the recess, Gerald's opening position had moved. Meaningfully, the settlement took for months. Not the explosive legal theater that some divorces become, no courtroom drama, no public ugliness. But it was not without cost, and I won't pretend otherwise. For months of documentation and negotiation and the particular exhaustion of dismantling a 14-year joint life with a yellow legal pad and 2 attorneys as intermediaries. The house remained mine. Patricia argued the premarital asset classification with the documentation I'd spent those 11 weeks assembling, and the opposing argument, built on 14 years of mortgage contribution and the claim that Renee's real estate expertise had enhanced the property's market position, did not survive contact with the specific, dated, comprehensive records I'd kept since 2006. Gerald Fitch was good at his job. He simply had less to work with than he'd expected when he took the case. Renee received a financial settlement that reflected her genuine contributions, her share of the joint savings, a fair accounting of her mortgage payments indexed against the premarital valuation, support structured around the boys' needs. She and her attorney pushed back on several points. Patricia pushed back harder. The co-listing with Owen disappeared from the agency website sometime in November. I didn't follow what happened to that particular arrangement. I found that I genuinely didn't need to. What I did follow, closely and completely, was the custody agreement. Joel and Caleb, the thing that mattered most and that the house question had, in Renee's calculation, been partly about. Giving the boys stability by keeping them in the Aldermore house under her roof. I understood the argument, even in the context of everything else. It wasn't a cynical one. She loved the boys. That much I had never doubted and never will. We settled on a joint custody arrangement, alternating weeks, shared decisions, both parents at every soccer game and school event. The boys would stay in the Aldermore house on my weeks and at Renee's new apartment on hers. I had worried about how they would absorb the split. What I underestimated was their resilience, which is the thing children teach you most reliably if you're paying attention. Joel asked me, 3 weeks after Renee moved out, whether I was sad. I thought about it before answering, which he noticed. Sometimes, I said. About what specifically? He asked, so precisely, so much like his mother in that moment that something shifted in my chest. About things not being what I thought they were, I said. He considered this. Does that mean you were wrong about them? Or they changed? I didn't have an answer for that and told him so, and he seemed satisfied, the way 11-year-olds are sometimes satisfied by honesty in the absence of conclusion. I spent the winter working. The Nashville trip we'd planned never happened. That version of it, anyway. Instead, I took the boys to Cincinnati in February for a long weekend, a museum and a Reds game and a hotel with a pool that Caleb decided was the best pool he'd ever been in, which is a specific kind of enthusiasm that makes everything else recede for a while. In March, I started the first renovation project I'd done on my own house in years. The back porch had needed rebuilding for 2 seasons, boards soft, railing loose, the kind of deferred maintenance that accumulates when life is full of other things. I started on a Saturday morning when the boys were with Renee, just me and a pry bar and a pile of cedar planks I'd sourced from a mill I'd used for years. There's something particular about working on a house by hand. I've done it my whole adult life, and I've never fully articulated what it gives me, but it has something to do with the honesty of it. The way a board is either level or it isn't. The way a joint either holds or it fails. There's no ambient narrative around the work. It is or it isn't. That clarity is not nothing. I thought about Renee while I worked, not with bitterness, which surprised me a little, more with the particular kind of sorrow that comes from understanding something too late to use it. We had been 2 self-made people who had, somewhere in the middle years, stopped building toward each other and started building parallel to each other. I don't know exactly when that happened or who moved first. What I know is that the distance had been real, and her answer to it had been what it was, and my answer to her answer had been what it was, and the 4 months of legal work and the house still standing under my name were just the architecture of that truth. I understood, kneeling on the back porch pulling up rotten boards, that I hadn't saved the house because I needed to win. I'd saved it because it was the only honest thing left to do. This house was real. I had built it. That reality deserved to be defended. Not for sentiment, not for spite, but because the truth of a thing is worth holding on to when other truths have collapsed. The new boards went down straight. Caleb came home that Sunday evening and walked out onto the porch and jumped on it once, testing it, the way he always tested things. It held. He nodded with the satisfied expression of a person who needed to know and now knows. Solid, he said. Yeah, I said. It'll hold. He went inside to get his homework. I stood on the porch for a while longer, in the March cold, looking at the yard. The tree the boys had climbed since they were 4. The patch of garden that no one had tended in 2 years. The fence line I'd built myself, posts set in concrete, still true and plumb after a decade. This was still a home. Different shaped than it had been, but real. That was enough. What this story ultimately exposes is the cost of treating a marriage like a project with separate contractors. Marcus and Renee were, individually, competent and capable people, both self-made, both professionally skilled, both building something real in their respective domains. What they failed to build was a shared interior life, a place where the distance between them could be named and addressed before it became a space large enough for a parallel existence to take root inside it. The affair was not the cause of their collapse. It was the symptom of a structure that had been quietly failing for years without either of them being willing to say so out loud. What makes this story psychologically particular is the way financial and emotional betrayal became entangled. Renee's affair with Owen was not simply personal. It was professionally interwoven, co-listed, planned. The below-market appraisal she commissioned is the detail that crystallizes something essential about the nature of her betrayal. She was not simply seeking emotional sustenance elsewhere. She was treating the marriage as an asset to be liquidated on favorable terms. The house that Marcus had built with his hands became, in her calculus, a piece of a future she'd already begun constructing with someone else. That is a specific kind of cold that goes beyond ordinary infidelity. It requires a quality of deliberate compartmentalization, the ability to sit at a dinner table with your children and your husband and continue, in the gaps of that life, to plan its replacement. Whether that capacity represents a failure of empathy or a form of self-protective logic that people in unhappy marriages sometimes construct to survive them is a question the story doesn't fully answer. Renee is not written as a villain, and the story is honest about that. She loved the boys. She built her career. She made a choice that cannot be defended, but the choice emerged from a marriage that had become, by degrees, a performance of togetherness rather than the thing itself. Marcus's silent preparation, The 11 weeks between knowing and acting is not portrayed as revenge in the theatrical sense. It is portrayed as the specific competence of a man who builds things. You assess the structure before you touch it. You document what is real. You do not tear out a wall before you know what it holds. That methodology, applied to the most personal crisis of his life, is both his strength and a window into who he had always been. The same emotional steadiness that made him a reliable husband and a trustworthy contractor had also made him someone who could go for months without naming what was wrong in his marriage. The discipline that saved the house was the same discipline that had helped the marriage drift past saving. The boys are the emotional center the story never fully unpacks, which feels true to how real family dissolution works. Joel's question, "Was it that you were wrong about them, or they changed?" is more sophisticated than an 11-year-old should be able to formulate, and yet it's exactly what children of intact seeming broken marriages absorb. They were watching. They registered things that neither parent acknowledged. Their resilience is real, but it was built on a foundation that included information they were never given directly. The house standing at the end, boards replaced, porch solid, rebuilt by a man who stayed, is not a triumph. It is a commitment to what was actual over what was performed. That distinction is the most honest thing the story has to say. What I keep thinking about is that appraiser. Not the affair, not the lock change. The appraiser Renee hired to undervalue the house Marcus had spent 4 years building before she ever walked through the door. Something about that detail feels like the most precise measure of what had gone wrong between them. Not that she wanted to leave, people leave, but that she tried to leave by converting something that was genuinely his into an instrument of transaction. There's a question underneath all of this that the story never quite asks directly. What happens to a person when the place they poured themselves into becomes a battleground? The house wasn't just real estate. It was the most honest version of Marcus that existed. Maybe that's what we protect when we build things. Not property. Proof that something we made was real.